before. Have you ever studied it at all? No? Has anybody studied it like you have?
Probably Alvin.
Alvin? Okay. He said it. Okay. So it's a fascinating topic, and it's one that I'm just going to say I'm not an expert in. And so if you ask questions, there may be questions that I don't know. And so I'm going to try and I took a class on the topic in 2020, starting in I think what was it? It was like January 2020, and so half of the class was what it was June 2020. Half the class we were in lockdown, and I didn't leave my house, and so I lost my mind for about half of it. And so it's a class that I've not looked at for a little while, but it's a really important and it's a really interesting topic. And so I'm going to try and talk and do it in a clear way. So if you have questions, or if I say something you don't, a word you don't know, or about something you don't know, ask questions and I'll try and clarify. I gave each one of you guys folders. I'm going to bring these back, or you can leave them with me, whatever you want. If you put your name in it, then bring it back. We're going to build on it each night, and at the end you'll have a little notebook if you're interested. So the way I've got it laid out, first page is your title page. Second page is the schedule. And then I have my outline that I'm using for this class. And if you got questions about any of that, I can clarify. My brain works weirdly sometimes. And then each week I'm going to give you guys some helpful names, terms, because that's really important. There's a lot of very specific terms, and I'm going to try and avoid using highly specific language as much as I can. But these words exist for a reason, and so they help to talk about what we're going to talk about. It's helpful to know them. So read through the vocab sheet, I guess. You want to talk through them first before we get into everything? Okay. So intertestamental period is kind of the definition that you really need to know for an intertestamental period class, right? What are we talking about with the intertestamental period? We're talking about the period between the end of the Old Testament, when the last Old Testament book is written, which is Malachi, and the New Testament begins, or the life of Christ begins. And so it's not a super precise term. There's some flexibility. And with the dates for virtually everything that I'm going to talk about, there's some things we have hard dates for, but a lot of things we have rough dates for. And so there's some different thoughts on dates for a lot of these things. But the intertestamental period covers the end of Malachi to the beginning of Christ, and it's about a 400-year time span. We're going to go a little bit beyond that. We're going to do about 500 years for this class. So that's intertestamental period. That's kind of the common term that's used by people to talk about this. If you want to get technical and fancy, or if you want to read a book about the intertestamental period, you'll run into the term Second Temple period. And what that's talking about is the same time frame, pretty much, just a little bit bigger. It's the time period of the building of the Second Temple. Remember that Solomon's temple gets destroyed and Zerubbabel builds up a new temple. It's the time frame where that temple stood. And so that goes from 515, which we know really hard date, that's when that temple was built, BC, all the way to 70 AD, when Rome came in and destroyed it. Diaspora Judaism. Have you heard the term diaspora before? Okay. It's a term that's used by James. When you talk about the Jews that are scattered abroad, that's what you're talking about. The term diaspora just means a spreading. And so you have a consequence of Nebuchadnezzar's exile and all the various events that are going to happen in this time period and before. You now have Jews that are not just located in the Promised Land, they're located everywhere. They're located in Rome and Greece and Egypt and Ethiopia and all kinds of places. You have Jews all over. And so Jews who aren't Jews that are practicing Judaism but are not living in the promised land, those are diaspora Jews. They're Jews that are scattered abroad. And that's a really big term. We'll talk about Alexander the Great here in a little bit. He's the king. Hellenism, we'll talk about that a lot today. It's the Greekification of things. It's the turning of culture in a Greek way. We'll talk about religious syncretism. That's a word that means, as the world became more and more Greek, religions around the world began to blend. And they begin to merge, but not just merge, but to blend. And so you're going to have things like Baal, the god of the Canaanites. He's going to be called Zeus because he's being equated with the Greek gods. You have a merging and a blending of religion. You're going to have Septuagint. You know what the Septuagint is? Okay, the Septuagint is really, really important. We may spend a section and talk about that later on. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And that's going to be really important because we'll talk here in a little bit about you've got a lot of Hebrews, a lot of Jews who don't speak Hebrew. And so they speak Greek. And so if they can't speak or read Hebrew, their mother tongue, what should be, you've got a problem because they can't know their Bibles. And so you're going to have a translation of the Old Testament into Greek. And as a matter of fact, when Paul and Jesus and most of the New Testament authors, when they quote from the Old Testament text, they're often quoting from the Septuagint and not the Hebrew Bible, which is kind of interesting. And so the Septuagint becomes the Bible of the early church, essentially. Very few Christians could read Hebrew for a really long time. And so when they were reading the Old Testament, they were reading the Septuagint, which is really interesting. And then finally, you have the term, the diadokoi, which I won't say much, but if you want to read stuff on the time period, you're going to run into that word. That word just means the successors. It's a term that talks about after Alexander dies, his 4 generals are going to take over his kingdom, and they're called the successors. And we'll talk about them a lot next week. Then you got a timeline on the last page that I think it's just helpful to kind of visualize what we're talking about. So as we get started then, the intertestamental period has major ramifications on the New Testament. You read through the Old Testament and you see a culture that is very distinct. The Jewish people are very different from everyone around them. And when you look at the culture of the Jews in the New Testament, you see a lot of differences, right? A lot of difference in Old Testament Judaism and New Testament Judaism. There's a lot of differences. You see groups like Pharisees and Sadducees and Zealots and Saccari and Herodians and Essenes and all these weird groups that appear, and they're not in the Old Testament, but they're in the New Testament. So where'd they come from? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. You've got political weirdness. A lot of the Old Testament, Israel is self-governing, right? They've got their own kings and their own judges, and God's kind of at the top of the totem. Well, now you have, suddenly, Romans. Who are the Romans? Where do they come into this picture? We're not even going to talk about the Romans today. We're going to talk about the Greeks. And so you have a whole empire that rises and falls in this time period that you don't even really hardly get anything about in the Bible. You get some prophecies that we'll look at, but nothing of the content. And so you've got the language change. You've got the monetary change. There's all kinds of changes. And so if you want to understand the New Testament, it really helps, first of all, to have a good grasp of the Old Testament. And second of all, it really helps to have an understanding, at least a surface level understanding of what happened in these 400 years. 400 years is a long time, right? How old's the United States? What? Yeah, it's 200. Yeah, I'm terrible at math. So, yeah, you could almost fit 2 United Stateses, the whole history of the United States, into that time frame. What was happening 400, 500 years ago?
They were just discovering the world was round.
Yeah, 1500s. Think about how much the world has changed in that time period. That's a huge time period. And so much has happened, and so many people, and so many influential figures, and that's an enormous time period. And so that's the time gap that we're talking about here. That's a long, long time. That's dozens of generations. And so there's a lot to come. So before we really get into stuff, any questions? Thoughts?
Was Malachi, was it actually the last?
I think so, yeah. Okay, but just to reiterate again, if you got questions, just pipe up. You don't have to raise your hand or anything. Just yell at me, tell me to stop talking, and we'll try and answer them. And again, I'm not an expert in this. There's people who are real experts in this. Some of my professors at college, they did their entire doctoral work on this Second Temple period, on intertestamental period times. And so I'm trying to, as I go through this series, I'm going to try and make it understandable and digestible and get you the highlights without getting bogged down in details. Because you can really get bogged down in names and dates and details. I'm just going to try and get you guys the highlights, and I'll be using a lot of my notes from that class. So let's talk about Alexander the Great a little bit. Look at that. One thing you're going to learn in this class, I've got all my PowerPoints done. I love a good mosaic. That's a good mosaic. That's a depiction of Alexander the Great riding his horse, whose name I can't remember.
Started with a B.
Yeah, it started with a B. It's like Boacles or something like that. He loved that horse. That's a picture of Alexander riding into battle. It's part of this huge mural that was found. That's pretty cool. Real fast, though, before we get into Alexander, we need to talk about Old Testament. David, what was it? It was about 2 months ago. David Watson filled in for me, and it was when we had the baby. We were listening in on his Wednesday class. David did a Israel in a nutshell class, and he covered a whole lot of material. But that was a really good class, I think. I don't think we typically have as good of a understanding of Old Testament chronology, Old Testament events as we probably should. You may know the name Esther, but where does Esther fall into the timeline? Or where does Josiah fall on the timeline? It really helps to have a good view of 1,000-yard view of the Old Testament. So you may want to look at that last page, that last map. The first era of Israel. We're going to look at different eras just to kind of get our ground on where we are in history. So obviously the Bible begins with creation. And each one of these dates is going to be approximations. 1876 BC, you have the era of the patriarchs. That goes all the way up to the end of the book of Genesis. You got a lot of time there. You got the formation of Israel. And, from the time that Israel has been enslaved in Egypt, there's a long span of time there, all the way up until you have really the period of the judges. Joshua leads the conquest. That's about 500 years or so. 530 years is kind of, if you do that math. You got the period of the judges. After Israel has been conquered, the promised land has been seized. You have these judges that rule over Israel, and some are good, some are bad, and it's really a mixed bag. It's a pretty tumultuous time for Israel. There's a lot of ups and a lot of downs, a lot of heroes and a lot of villains. That's about 300 years. Then you have the United Kingdom. Saul becomes king over Israel. And then you have David. And then you have Solomon. And then you have a short period of time of Solomon's son, who's named Rehoboam. And Rehoboam decides, you know what, I'm going to not listen to any good advice, and I'm going to be really harsh. And so then you have a period of the kingdom splitting. So the kingdom's united for about 200 years, or united for about 120 years. Then you have the kingdoms divided. You got the northern kingdom of of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah, and they exist for about 209 years. And then what happens to end the divided kingdom era? There's a big event. Yeah, the Assyrian conquest. The Assyrians, who are really nasty guys, they came in and they conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and they lead them into captivity. And so you have that era ends, and then there's an era where Judah alone is the last faithful bastion, I guess. And there's a period of about 117 years. But Judah has issues just like the northern kingdom, and that era comes to an end with what? The Babylonian conquest. So Babylon comes in, as was prophesied, and they destroy Jerusalem. They lay siege to Jerusalem. And you have 70 years of exile to Babylon. During that time, Babylon gets conquered itself. Who conquers Babylon? Yeah, the Medes and the Persians. And so they conquer Babylon. And then the Medes and the Persians were a very lenient society, actually. And they were very permissive and very respectful, in comparison, at least, to what you see with the Babylonians. And they allow some to go back to their promised land or come back home. And you have 516 to 432, a period of restoration, where you have the temple is reconstructed. You've got Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, and kind of this powerhouse group. You got some prophets there. You can see the prophets on that little chart, and you have a period of restoration. And then you have the book of Micah, and Micah ends with a prophecy about who? Close. John the Baptist. There's going to be one who's going to come, who's going to pave the way. And so you have that last little bastion of hope, and then you have 400 years of silence, where there are no more prophets. Throughout all of those time periods, up until you get to the intertestamental period, you've got lots and lots and lots of prophets. You got some times where God's speaking directly to people. You got lots of occasions where God's speaking through people. And then suddenly it stops. What might that do to you as a people? How do you imagine people took that? What would you do?
I feel like they've been abandoned.
Yeah, you'd feel abandoned. And they do. And so there's a large contingency of Jews, particularly those who are in the diaspora, those who are spread out, that begin to feel abandoned by God. We're going to talk a lot about Josephus. Our primary source, like if you want to read primary source material on this time period, read Josephus. He writes a lot about this. And he says, this drove some people crazy. They wanted to hear from God, and God wasn't talking. And so you have, they try and fill in the gaps. Last summer, we talked about how we got the Bible. And we talked a lot about Apocrypha, right? Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha and those fun words. If you read a Catholic Bible, you'll see that there's more books in the Bible, in the Catholic version, Catholic Bible, than your Bible. And so there's a bunch of books that were written in this time period, these 400 years. The whole Apocrypha was written in this time period. They're books that act as if they're inspired, but aren't inspired. And books that have lots of, they don't, we can talk about Apocrypha later if you want, but they are not inspired the same way that the rest of Paul's or the rest of the Old Testament's inspired. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to fill in the gap. God's not talking to us, so we need some kind of new revelation to help guide our people. And so you got guys like, there's a man whose name is Jesus ben Sirach, who writes the book, you may have seen it or heard of it. It's got a lot of different names. It might be called Wisdom of Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus. And he does a lot of wisdom writing, but it's not the same. It's not Scripture. And so there's this period where people are really feeling lost, and they want God to speak, and they want to, invite His good favor once again. And so we'll talk about that a lot when we talk about these different sects that arise, because that's a lot of the reason why these Jewish sects arise. So that's kind of our nutshell where we are in history. Any questions about that? I went really fast.
Is there any theories as to why there was this 400-year period?
God didn't want to talk. He'd given them what they needed, and He was. We'll see that this is a period that really sets the stage for Jesus. A lot of the reasons why the world was so receptive and the world was so able to receive Jesus is because of the things that are going to happen in this time period. And so this is a preparatory time period.
What about the books that the Catholics you say have that we do not?
Yeah.
Are they essential or why
Yeah, they're not. And even the Catholics don't say that they're inspired the same way that the rest of the Bible is. They say that they're of secondary status. And so, do it?
Where did they get them?
Well, they became popular books in this time period. Yeah, they're all written in that time period. And it's also, talking about the Apocrypha real quick, people even then recognized that they were not Scripture. Josephus writes, and he says, listen, we got a lot of guys that are writing a lot of books, but they don't even bear the same, they're not the same quality, they're not the same as the Scripture. And so people read these, a lot of them are just for entertainment. You read the book of Tobit, and it's just a fun book. It's about that guy with the fish that a bird poops in his dad's eye, and he goes on a quest to restore his dad's vision. It's it's just a fun story. And so that's a lot of the apocryphal type books. But they didn't recognize that they're inspired, and they're certainly not. But this is the era where they come about. Any other thoughts or questions on this history before we get into what we're actually going to talk about today? Does this make sense so far? Have I lost anybody? Okay. If I have, yell at me. So, in the Bible, you have several prophecies about Alexander. And this is really some interesting stuff. These are prophecies that were written years or centuries before Alexander would ever come to power. In the book of Daniel, we looked at this, I think, last week. You have Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Look at Daniel chapter 2, if you got your Bibles. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 31 through 45, I won't... Should I read the whole thing? Okay, we'll read the whole thing. Daniel is interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream for him. He's had this dream that disturbs him. And then Daniel tells him what the dream is, and then he interprets it. He says, "You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked at the stone, was it cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on the feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. Then the iron and clay and bronze and silver and gold all together were broken into pieces and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and was filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell you, O king, its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand has given wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them. You are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise before you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks into pieces and shatters all things. And iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay, partly of iron. It shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with soft clay. And the toes and the feet were partly of iron, partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong, partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with the soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of the king of God will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break into pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain by no human hand, and it broke into pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. Whew. That's a lot. So what's being said here? You have this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and he identifies several parts of the dream. He identifies the head of gold as being who? Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar's empire. He identifies the stone. What's the stone? It's the kingdom that God's going to establish. It's the church. It's God's ultimate kingdom. And so he says, listen, Nebuchadnezzar, there's going to be a kingdom that's going to come after you. They're going to conquer you. And then there's going to come a kingdom that's after them, and they're going to conquer them. And then you're going to have a kingdom that comes after them, and they're going to conquer them. And then will the kingdom that the Lord establishes reign forever, and it will not be conquered. And so you have this vision of the Babylonians. What do we know happens to the Babylonians? They're conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And then in this 400-year time gap, what happens to the Babylonians and the Persians and the Medes? They're going down. And the one who brings them down is this Alexander the Great. He brings them down at a battle called Ipsus or Issus. I can't remember which one. There's two of them. But he defeats the Persians. And what ultimately happens to Alexander's kingdom? It's going to crumble. It was not well established. And because of its poor establishment, the Romans will eventually rise to power. And then what's going to happen to Rome? Yeah, the church will conquer all eventually. So you have Alexander, not mentioned by name, but certainly mentioned here as his kingdom is one of these kingdoms. You have a vision of a ram, and this one is really, really interesting because it's so specific. Look at Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8, verses 20 through 22. We may read this one next week too, just because it's going to be applicable to what we're going to talk about next week. But Daniel 8, 20 through 22. As for the ram that you saw with two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And so you have this very clear, pointing out who this is. It says this goat is the king of Greece, and he's going to conquer the Persians and the Medes. And his kingdom, though, is going to eventually be split into 4. And it will not stand. It will not be as great as it was. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next week. Yeah.
And part of that wasn't it because Alexander died, so
Yes. Yeah.
it's 30.
Yeah. He was 32. And so we'll talk about that in just 5 minutes. But yeah, we may come back to that here in a minute. And then one other prophecy that I think is really fascinating, Ezekiel chapter 26, verses 14 through 15. In this area, in the Middle East, you got this empire called the Phoenicians. And they're a really, really strong force. Their capital city is the city of Tyre. And Tyre is this fascinating city because part of Tyre is on the mainland. It's right on the coast. But the other half of Tyre is a little island. And so you have it's the same city, but it's separated by the ocean. And so Ezekiel prophesies, and we won't get into the whole prophecy, but look at verses 14 through 15. He says, I will make you, talking about Tyre, a bare walk, and you shall be a place for the spreading of nets. You shall never be rebuilt, for I am the Lord, I have spoken, declares the Lord God. Thus says the Lord God to Tyre, will not the coastland shake at the sound of your fall, when the wounded groan and when slaughter is made in your midst? And it goes on and on. Here's Tyre. This is really interesting because you got what used to be an island, and then you have the mainland. And notice there's like hardly nothing there. What happened is King Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Tyre, and then ultimately he conquered mainland Tyre, as this prophecy predicts. And then, when Alexander comes in and conquers, Tyre has been this little bastion up on the sea, and Alexander says, you know what, let's just get rid of them. And so you know what he does? He takes all the rubble and all the destruction of this ancient capital, and he builds a bridge to the island. And so what you see here, this white stuff, is a man-made causeway in the ocean. He said, I can't march my army to you, so I'm going to make a way to march my army to you. And that's insane. He scrapes the ground and lays it bare, and now you can, when the high tide's up, it kind of floods over, and you can cast your nets on it, which is wild. That's the kind of power of who we're going to be talking about. Somebody who can make, the ocean, make an island not an island. Is the kind of thing that Alexander can do. So who is Alexander the Great? He's king of the Greeks. Greece is we think of Greece as Greece today sometimes. Greece is a united country today, right? But to be a Greek in this time period, they were very, very divided. And so you had like city-states in Greece that became like their own little miniature kingdoms. And you got like Athenian Greece and Spartan Greece and Carthaginian Greece and all these different little pockets of Greece that are always fighting together. Alexander the Great's dad, a guy by the name of Philip of Macedon II, he was a really powerful king, and he united Greece essentially. In his kingdom, he was a Macedonian, or Macedonian if you want to say it correctly, but he united Greece. The Macedonians were a flavor of Greek. And so Alexander, ultimately inherited the throne when his dad died. He probably killed his dad. We don't know for certain, but he probably had his dad assassinated. And so he inherits the kingdom of Macedonia, when he was 20 years old in 336 BC. What kind of person kills their dad for power? A great man, but maybe not a good man. So Alexander is called the Great, not because he's good, but because he did great things. And I think that's true. There's a quote that goes something along the lines of, great men make good times make soft men make hard times make great men, or something like that. It's the cycle of the world. And Alexander was certainly a great man.
What would have been the problem with Philip? Why would his son take him out other than just he wanted to control?
I don't know much about Philip. I'm not an expert, but
Right.
yeah, I don't know much about him. All I know about him is that he paved the way for Alexander.
Alexander was great because of what he accomplished,
Yeah,
not a great person.
not moral excellency
I
for sure.
think there's a quote too that, when he conquered the world, he was very unhappy because there's nobody else to kill.
Yeah.
That says a lot about his character.
Yeah.
That he loved battle, he loved bloodshed, and that made him great, but not what we call.
Yeah, yeah. He was great in the sense of he accomplished big things, not moral greatness. And so basically, as soon as he becomes king, he begins to say, well, you know what? There's a large world out there that I want to own. And so he decides, I'm going to own it. And he owns it. Here's another interesting side note about his background before we get into it. Alexander had a tutor by the name of Aristotle. So Alexander, in this time period, you don't go to school. They don't have school like we have school. If you're rich, your family hires you a tutor to teach you everything that you need to know. His dad hired him Aristotle, the father of philosophy, essentially. And so Aristotle actually ends up outliving Alexander, which is kind of interesting. But he then says, there's a world and I want it. And so he then takes it. And it does not take Alexander long. Alexander's only going to be king for 12 years. He's going to die when he's 32. And at the time that he's king, he's conquered virtually everything that there is. It's every major power in the world at the time he has conquered. It's incredible. And so he's, a incredible military strategist. He's a genius. He does all kinds of things that you would think are just absolutely crazy, and he does it and pulls it off. And we won't get into all of his battles and all that kind of stuff. But if you're interested in old-timey battles, read some of the things he did. It is mind-boggling that anyone has the amount of power that he had, the amount of control over his troops that he had, and the will to do these things. But he was driven. And so part of his vision for conquering the world was he wanted to not just conquer the world, but he wanted to make the world Greek. And so that's where you have this idea of Hellenization. The word Hellenization, where do you think that word comes from? Have you ever read the Iliad or the Odyssey? Yeah. Who's the whole war fought over? Helen of Troy, right? And so Helenos, becomes the word the Greeks used to describe themselves, and still is. And so he's Greekifying the world, is really his vision. And he does that in a lot of different ways. But it's really this incredible conquest. A lot of the rulers that you had in previous empires, they don't particularly care to make you Babylonian. They don't particularly care, especially the Persians, they don't particularly care to make you Persian. They just want you to be at peace. And Alexander says, no, we're not doing that. You're going to become Greek. And that's a big difference. When we think about that, King Nebuchadnezzar, when you think about this, we'll talk about this more in 2 weeks, but when you think about the Samaritans, they have their roots in King Nebuchadnezzar. Because what Nebuchadnezzar thought was, I don't really care that they become Babylonians, but what I care is that they can't rebel against me. Emperors are always afraid of the people. That's just a good political philosophy point for you. So do with that what you want. Go out and buy a handgun. He doesn't care. And so what he does is he mixes and mingles. He takes people from over here and he puts them over here, and he takes people from over there and puts them over there, and he mixes and mingles, and now you have like half-breed Samaritans. The king of the Persians, he just doesn't care all that much to begin with, and he says, just be at peace and pay me taxes, and I don't care. Rome is like that. Rome says, I don't care what you do, just give us taxes. But Alexander says, no, you're going to become Greek. And so he begins imposing Greek philosophy and Greek ideas and all sorts of things. But he dies really young. He dies at 32. And we don't know how he died exactly. There's a lot of different, he may have been assassinated, some people think. He died in Babylon, in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. But he died probably from, what do you get from mosquitoes? Malaria. He probably died from malaria, is what most people kind of agree on. But when he died, he has a problem. He doesn't have a clear heir. And so he has several children, several illegitimate children, and one child who would be his heir, except when he dies, his wife either just had the kid or is pregnant. His wife is named Roxanne, and I can hardly say the word Roxanne without singing Roxanne, but I will spare you. So you have this problem, though. He doesn't have somebody to take his throne, and the one that he has, could, but you're going to have to wait a while, and he's weak. And so Alexander's generals, who are power-hungry guys themselves, they see an opening. And so they pounce. And so you got Ptolemy the First Soter. These guys have great nicknames, by the way. Ptolemy is going to be really, really important. We're going to talk about him a lot next week. His nickname Soter is the word savior in Greek. And he's really associated with Egypt. So his kingdom gets divided. Ptolemy takes Egypt. You have Seleucus the First, Nicator, Nike, like Nike, is the word victory. So he's Seleucus the First, the victor, which is a cool name. Then you got, he takes like the west, like the parts of Asia that he has conquered. You got a guy by the name of Antigonus the First, and this is a cool name, Monophthalmus. You know what that means? Mono, one. Anybody see an ophthalmologist? What are you doing for an ophthalmologist? It's an eye doctor, right? Antigonus the one-eyed. So he's really old, though, when he takes over. He's 80 years old or something like around there. And so he's going to die pretty soon after. And he's not going to keep the kingdom that he has for very long. And then you got a guy by the name of Cassander. And Cassander takes the parts that are associated with Greece and the European part of his empire. Antigonus took like Asia Minor and Macedon and that kind of thing. So, doesn't that sound familiar? Is that not exactly what Daniel prophesied? Yeah, Daniel said you're going to have a king, he's going to conquer the Persians, he's going to die, and his kingdom's going to be split 4 ways. And that's exactly what happened. There's without obstruction. That's Alexander. Cool looking dude. I love a good mosaic. That was my background picture from on my computer for a really long time. And then Claire said, "You clearly don't love me. There's no pictures of me in this office." So I figured I gotta do what? Yeah.
Did Alexander the Great, this is probably a crazy question, did he fear God?
No. Yeah. Not at all. He was Greek through and through, and he probably wasn't even a good Greek. I don't know.
I think he had a terrible temper. And he the one that killed his best friend.
Probably, yeah.
He flew off mad one day and killed his best friend. And that may have been why he had such control. Was they were afraid of him.
Yeah.
It wasn't until he died
Yeah.
that these guys had the audacity or the bravery or whatever it would take to
He has no qualms about ending you.
Right.
It's like squishing an ant.
Well, you knew it was evil, but I didn't know if there was anything that indicated that.
Yeah, well, here's an interesting, it's disputed whether it actually happened. We may talk about it some next week. But Alexander, according to some sources, which it's 50-50 whether this happened or not, he met with the high priest, the son of the high priest that you read about, the last high priest in the Old Testament, whose name I can't remember. He did meet with him at one occasion, and it didn't end well. But he's like, you guys are obnoxious, but you Jews, you got so many scruples. That's kind of how it went. But
Did he kill him?
he didn't kill him, no. So I guess that's yeah. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Any questions on Alexander's life before we? Yeah.
Okay, Alexander, wherever he went, he wanted everybody to just become Greek.
Pretty much.
But now, Romans, you weren't considered a Roman unless you were born in Italy, right? Where Alexander didn't care where you were from. Or
Yeah,
anything.
well, he wasn't necessarily making you a Greek citizen. I don't know what his policies were on citizenships, but he wanted you to adopt Greek culture.
But when the Romans come in, they didn't try to bring their culture or impose their culture on whoever they took over. They were just gonna take over and you paying taxes.
Pretty much, yeah.
They wanted you to be quiet.
Rome had certain things that they wanted, but by and large, they said, if you're happy, just be quiet, pay taxes, and we can get
Because
along.
wasn't it Peter that they couldn't touch him one time when he was in jail? Because
Paul,
he was
yeah.
Roman.
Paul was a
Because he
Roman
was
citizen.
Roman.
Yeah.
But you have to be legitimately from like Rome or Italy to
Yeah.
be considered that. Not just-
No, there were various ways to become a Roman citizen. You could buy it. And so what it probably says about Paul was that he was really rich. He came from a rich family. And maybe his parents might have been him himself, although it probably somebody along his family tree became a Roman citizen, and then all their children became citizens. And so Paul probably bought it, or maybe somewhere along the line, one of his ancestors was a slave and he was freed, and there's a lot of different ways. Do what? Yeah. We can talk about that. I don't know if I put stuff in here about Rome as much as I should. We may do an extra class on Rome.
But backing up just a little
Yeah.
bit, the Greeks were the one that moved everybody.
That was mostly the Babylonians.
Babylon.
Yeah.
And it really worked because they couldn't agree with each other. But I was
Yeah.
thinking, even later with the Samaritans, they brought people in there, then they were considered half-breeds.
Yeah.
And they ended up hating each other.
Yeah.
So it really worked.
Yeah, well, for Nebuchadnezzar, it worked for a while, and I don't think he realized how quickly people can learn each other's languages and intermarry, and it didn't work as well as he thought it would. But yeah, so here you got a picture of Alexander. This is what Alexander's kingdom eventually looked like. That's just an enormous kingdom. Like, Rome will have a bigger empire, but that's enormous. And he started there. That was where he started. He had unified Greece, and then he went and did all of that in 12 years. That's crazy. Yeah, you have something?
Remember the Black Sea is there, there's like a little lake that sticks up above it?
Yeah.
We pointed that up to the very tip of it,
Yeah.
little Black Sea.
Oh.
Let's get right up, little high. That's where Nicholas is from.
Oh, that's cool. So, yeah, but here's something interesting. Rome exists, but Rome is not a superpower by any means. Rome's just a little local power. And so this is before the Roman Empire even was a thought. It was before the Roman Republic was really even a thing. And so Rome doesn't become a superpower for another 100, 200 years. This is what it looks like after the kingdom is split. And so we may look at this a little bit more, but you got Ptolemies in the south with Egypt area, and then the Antiochus, the Seleucid Empire over here, Antigonus. Seleucus is going to kind of take over all of that. They're going to kind of just fade. But you've got, these are the two big names that are going to be really, really important. They're going to have a lot of wars. We're going to talk about next week. How might that affect Israel? if this group and this group are going to fight a war, where are they going to fight it? Israel. And so Israel's going to get decimated by these two powerhouses fighting each other. And so it's going to be bloody. So Hellenism, this is where we'll end off. I know we've been here for a little while. Hellenism is the Greekification. And so Alexander was a big fan of it. He wanted to do it, conquered everybody. And a lot of people were really happy about it. A lot of the people that he conquered were like very okay with it. But a lot weren't. We're talking mostly about Jews in this class, I guess. But there were a lot of Jews who welcomed it. But there were a lot of Jews who didn't. So we're going to talk about some of the different factors of Hellenism and think about why the Jews might have rejected them. But this is going to be a really big issue. So you got Greek cities that begin to come up all over the place. You see this with like Ephesus, right? Ephesus is a Greek colony city. You got Thessalonica, and you got lots of these different Greek cities that kind of pop up all over the place. And what these Greek cities do is they become colonies, and they're full of Greek people, and they become really powerful forces wherever they're at. There's an attempt to make, and Hellenization begins with Alexander, but it doesn't end with him. It's going to go on in his successive split empires. This is going to go on for a really long time. There's going to be an attempt to make Jerusalem a Greek city. And it was kind of for a little while. And you can imagine there was a lot of pushback. They changed the name of Jerusalem, and so there's going to be some pushback. Greek cities, because they're Greek cities, they begin to do lots of... think about what this would do to your culture. If you now have big, powerful cities, it shifted culture away from like small villages and countryside living to now city life. Is there a big difference today in city life and country life? Yeah. These Greek cities had lots of things that became big issues, particularly for Jews. They had gymnasiums everywhere. What does a gymnasium mean? This is not your elementary school gymnasium. The word gymnasium, the first word is gymnos, which means naked. And so it's places where you go and work out naked. They have social events like the Olympics and things where everybody's always naked all the time. You think that offends Jewish sensibilities? Oh yeah. You got to be a good citizen in Greco-Roman world, in Greece and particularly in Rome though. To be a good citizen, you have to participate in civic religion. And you got to participate in idol worship as a part of your day-to-day life, or else you're ostracized. That's part of city life, is, you go about and you do your homage to the temple, to Zeus or whatever, and you go about your day, and that's going to be a big problem. You got religious syncretism, which was on your little vocab sheet. Greek religion began to blend and merge with all the native religions of the people that they conquered. And so you have like Baal, who's god of the Canaanites. They stopped calling him Baal. They call him Zeus. Why? Because Baal is the chief god of the Canaanites. And Zeus is the chief god of the Greeks. And so really, they're basically the same thing. So, Baal is Zeus. Why might that be an issue for the Jews? They try to do it with God. And so they try and call God, Yahweh, Zeus. What's the problem with that? God's not Zeus. And so this becomes a really big issue. And there's some Jews that are fine with it. And there's a large majority of Jews, though, that were like, are you kidding? Absolutely not. And so this becomes a really big hot button issue. You got individualism. individuals became, you stop thinking of yourself as a part of a community, and you begin to think of yourself as a person, as a specific individual. And so this is, I think, really relevant to the world we live in today. As culture shifts, and the things in society that you would fit into are no longer there. What are you going to do? Your family has been, shepherds for 1,000 years, and suddenly, you have new opportunities to do Greek things, or maybe it's, some kind of thing that Greece has outlawed, and now you can't do the family trade, and you have to do it this other way, and so now you've got to blaze your own path and try and fit in. And so you have this increase of individualism, which is really unmooring for people, and people begin to lose, their vision for their future, and that becomes a really big problem, which I think is 99% of our problems today. But you have some other things that, like a common language. Everybody speaks Greek. It becomes called, what's it become called? Koine Greek, which means common Greek, which is the kind of Greek that I study, because that's what the Bible's written in. And so everybody begins to speak the same language. And there's some good things for that. You can go virtually anywhere in this massive empire and understand each other and be able to communicate with each other and buy and trade and sell and stuff. Some downside, the Jews who are living abroad that maybe aren't located in Israel where Hebrew is still spoken as the primary language, they don't know Hebrew anymore. And so now you have an issue of, you got a lot of Jews who can't read Greek or can't read Hebrew, so they need a Greek Bible because Greek is the language that they know. And so Ptolemy, in the Ptolemaic Empire later on, they're going to create the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Common currency, economics are now united, Greek education. This is a really big one. And this is one that I think we won't get into a lot, but it's going to have a massive impact. People are now literate. Literacy begins to explode across the world. And you have a lot of people who used to not be able to read anything, a lot of languages that didn't have a written language. There are lots of languages that were spoken but not written. Now they have a language to write in, and they're able to read. That's big. And Greek philosophy takes over the world. We won't get into Greek philosophy a lot, but it's really, really important. And it might be good to some other time, not this class, have a 101, because you can see, Paul talks about things in Greek philosophical terms. You got people like the Plato, right? Not Play-Doh, but Plato. Plato is really famous for his kind of his world of ideals, where we can't even get into all of it, but he's going to be a big impact on people like Philo of Alexandria, who's going to be the primary thought leader for the Jews in the first century. He's going to shape, Jewish thought because he's been exposed to Greek philosophy. People like Aristotle, who's the father of taxonomy. He puts things into categories, is what he does. And you've got Stoicism. And Paul talks about, he uses a lot of Stoic terminology, especially in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, because Corinth was a bastion of Stoicism. And then you have Epicureanism, which is like the philosophy of just give me what feels good, and I want to do what I want to do, and I want to do it, and I don't care about the consequences. And you've got all kinds of things, and we won't get into all of that. But as Hellenism expands throughout the world, those ideas expand too. And now you have a world that's beginning to think differently than they used to think. And that's going to have some major impact. Any thoughts on that? That's what I got for today. This is super important, because these are the things that are going to shape what's going on in the first century. They're going to shape the context of Jesus. when Paul's writing, he's fighting against Greek philosophy just as much as he is fighting against, Jewish Christianity type stuff. These are going to be issues. Any thoughts on any Hellenism stuff? Did all this make sense? Did I go too fast? Or
What is the difference between this look at Hellenism and the Hellenists that are spoken of,
yeah,
that Paul talks about
yeah.
with the widows?
Yeah, so yeah, you have in Acts Jews that are Hellenistic Jews that are being mistreated. They're widows, right? But they're Christians. They would have been Jews that were probably abroad, maybe. There would have been Jews. You didn't have to be abroad to be Hellenized, which we're going to look at pretty soon. But they would have been more of the normal Jews would have seen them as real liberals because they were Greekified Jews. But Paul says, hey, they're Christians just like you are. Take care of them. What are you doing? That would have been, they would have had a background in Greek culture more than some other Jews would. Any thoughts, questions?
Didn't they allow women to divorce and the Hellenism, women had more rights?
Yeah. I don't know.
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear what she said.
Women's roles in
Oh, in Greek.
Greek culture. Yeah. Oh. Okay, well, next week we're going to talk about